Some life events are so unforeseen that they leave an impression that can't be erased. That's how it felt the day Zay unexpectedly entered my room. It was a typical afternoon. My husband Adil was at work as usual, and Zayn, his son from a prior marriage, had recently returned after a distressing separation. Since Zayn's return, we had been cautious with each other, trying to prevent old tensions from resurfacing. I was in my room, trying on a dress for an upcoming event, when I decided to change into something else. The door opened while I was changing, standing in my pants. Make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can continue sharing fascinating and real stories like these. Also, don't forget to watch this video to the end and like it, as the story will be quite entertaining. Please click the like button to show your support. Maya, did you see Zayn? Adil's voice was cut off. Zayn stopped in the doorway, his eyes widening. I gasped and quickly reached for anything to cover myself. Zayn? I shouted, but he swiftly turned away, nearly tripping. The door slammed shut, leaving me standing there, red with embarrassment and confusion. Zayn's return had unsettled me. Adil had suggested it without consulting me first. While it wasn't surprising considering Adil's habit of making decisions without thinking of the consequences, it still felt strange. Zayn needs a place to stay for a while, Adil had said one evening, barely looking up from his phone. You don't mind, do you? Naturally, I couldn't refuse. Zayn had always been charming but distant, and we'd kept a polite, though shallow, relationship. But having him here was different. His presence constantly reminded me of Adil's past, which made everything feel awkward. Zayn was undeniably handsome. At 25, he shared Adil's black hair and strong jaw, but his eyes were gentler and more focused. He carried himself with a calm confidence, which made his recent sorrow all the more surprising. I cheated on her, Zayn confessed one night at dinner when Adil wasn't around. I had tried to keep the conversation light, but Zayn's bluntness caught me off guard. I'm sorry, I said. Don't be, he shrugged. This happened one Wednesday afternoon, when Zayn was supposed to be out running errands. I was in my room trying on dresses for an upcoming charity event. The dress didn't fit as I remembered, so I sighed and threw it on the bed. I was standing there in my bra and underwear, searching for something else when the door opened. Maya, did you see Zayn? Adil's voice was cut off abruptly as his eyes took in the scene. I froze, my hand still holding the hanger, while his gaze shifted between me and the floor. His face turned bright red, and he spun around, almost knocking over a lamp. I'm sorry, he stammered, backing out of the room. Zayn gasped, grabbed a robe, and the door slammed shut. I stood there, my heart racing as I processed what had just happened. For the rest of the day, I avoided him. I stayed in my room pretending to be busy, but I couldn't concentrate on anything. The memory of his shocked face haunted me, and each time I thought about it, a wave of humiliation washed over me. The evening meal was tense. Did you run those errands today? I asked, trying to sound casual. Yeah, Zayn said, not looking up from his plate. Adil glanced between us, unaware of the discomfort. I told Zayn he should take some time to think things over. That's a great idea, I replied, my voice a bit too high-pitched. Zayn looked up, his expression unreadable. I appreciate your hospitality, he said. I won't stay longer than necessary. Don't be ridiculous, Adil responded, dismissing the suggestion. You're family. The days that followed were miserable. Every conversation with Zayn felt tense, as though we were both trying not to cross some invisible line. He avoided being alone with me, and I told myself it was for the best. Despite my efforts to forget about the incident, I found myself thinking about it more often than I wanted to. One evening, I noticed him briefly looking at me from across the room. His gaze was fleeting, yet it lingered long enough to make my stomach flutter. I quickly looked away, trying not to acknowledge it, but the moment stayed with me. It didn't take long before I saw shifts in his actions. He began arriving home earlier and spending more time in shared spaces. One evening, I found him in the kitchen, leaning against the counter, holding a glass of water. Can't sleep? I asked, keeping my tone light. He shrugged. Something like that. We stood in silence for a moment, the only sound being the hum of the refrigerator. He quietly apologized. You don't need to apologize, I replied quickly. I shouldn't have just walked in, he said, his eyes glued to the floor. It was an accident, I murmured softly. Let's forget about that. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine. Is this what you want? The question caught me off guard. I wasn't sure how to respond. It's for the best, I finally admitted. He nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Things reached a breaking point one night when a client contacted him to let him know he'd be working late. When Zane entered, I was in the living room, flipping through a magazine. He hesitated at the doorway, unsure whether to stay or leave. Want to watch something? He finally asked, gesturing to the TV. Sure, I said, putting the magazine down. He sat beside me. We watched in silence, but the air between us was thick with unspoken tension. Our hands brushed briefly as we both reached for the remote, and I felt a spark. He quickly pulled his hand back, his face turning pink. Sorry, he muttered. It's okay, I replied, my voice shaky. The moment passed, but it left behind a lingering feeling of possibility, which we both ignored. A few nights later, I stayed awake long past midnight. The house was still, save for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock. I got out of bed and went to the kitchen to make tea, only to find Zane already there. He sat at the table, a mug of coffee in his hands. His expression was distant. Can't sleep either? I asked, leaning against the doorframe. He looked up, surprised, and offered a small smile. Something like that. I made myself a cup of tea and sat down across from him. For a moment, we sat in silence. Then, unexpectedly, he broke the stillness. Have you ever felt trapped? He asked, his voice quiet and calm. Trapped? I murmured, turning my head toward him. Like you're just going through the motions? He said, gazing into his coffee. Doing what everyone expects, but never really living for yourself. His words hit me harder than I anticipated. I paused before answering. Yes, I replied gently. More often than I'd like to admit, he said, his gaze fixed on me. What will you do about it? I'm not sure, I confessed. I've spent so much time putting others first, making this house my priority, never thinking about what I want. Zane's look was unwavering. Maybe it's time you did. His words hung in the air between us, presenting a challenge I wasn't certain I was ready for. After that night, everything between us shifted. It started subtly, a lingering look, a handshake in the hallway. Zane came to see me one afternoon while I was pruning roses in the garden. Need help? He asked, crouching next to me. Do you know how to trim a rose bush? I teased. He smiled. No idea. I chuckled and handed him the scissors. Well, I hope you don't kill it. As we worked side by side, I felt a calmness I hadn't felt in years. Zane's presence anchored me in unexpected ways. You're good at this, I observed, watching him carefully clip a branch. It's just the beginning. He smiled. No, really, I insisted. You have a sharp eye for detail. He looked at me, his expression softening. Maybe I learned it from watching you. His compliment took me by surprise, leaving me speechless for a moment. Later that evening, as we cleaned up after dinner, our hands brushed again as we reached for the same dish. The brief contact sent a shock through me, reminding me of everything that had been building between us. Sorry? Zane murmured quickly, pulling his hand back. It's fine, I said. I responded, my voice quivering. He paused before speaking again, murmuring, S.A., staring up at me. Nothing. Never mind. The tension between us was palpable, and I realized that things were about to change as time went on. The differences between Zane and me became increasingly obvious, and we could no longer conceal them. The mansion, once a refuge, now seemed like a seething cauldron of secrets. Eventually, the unavoidable happened. One morning, Otto confronted me in the kitchen, his face drained of color, his hands shaking as he held out his phone to show proof of what had transpired. I know what's been happening, Adil continued, his voice filled with disbelief and fury. How long has this been going on? I couldn't bring myself to meet his gaze. Months, I murmured, tears streaming down my face. Adil's face turned crimson with rage. Months? I've been working to build this for us, and you've been... His voice cracked, and I could see the pain in his eyes, but it was too late. At that moment, Zane entered the room, his expression hardening as he took in the scene. Adil, this isn't all her fault, he said, calm yet firm. Don't defend her. Adil yelled, his anger directed at Zane. You were supposed to be my son, and you betrayed me. I didn't plan for this to happen, Zane responded resolutely, but I love her. Adil was incredulous. Do you really think this is love? This is selfishness. The argument escalated quickly with accusations flying, while I stood there, caught in the middle, helpless. Finally, Adil screamed, "Get out! Both of you, leave my house!" "Please, Adil," I begged, but he turned away from me, his face set with determination. "I don't want to hear it. You've made your choice." Zayn and I quietly gathered our things. The heaviness of our decision hung in the air as I placed my bag in the car. Looking back at the house, it no longer felt like home. It was just a place where I once lived. "Are you sure about this?" I asked Zayn as we got into the car. He didn't respond right away, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I don't know," I admitted softly, the uncertainty pressing down on me. As we drove away, my phone vibrated. Laura had sent a message with a link to a social media post. The post contained screenshots of messages between Zayn and me. The reaction was swift and harsh. Friends and family turned their backs on me, their judgment severe and cruel. A divorce was filed within days, and they abandoned me, leaving me to piece together my broken life. Zayn tried to support me, but even he couldn't shield me from the storm. The weight of our decision became clearer with time. The cracks in our relationship were impossible to ignore. One evening, as we sat in the modest apartment we had rented, Zayn gave me a serious look. "This isn't what you wanted," he said quietly. I stared at him, tears welling in my eyes. "It's not what you wanted either." Zayn stood and walked towards the door. He paused to look back at me. "I will always care about you," he murmured softly, "but we can't keep doing this." With that, he was gone. In the months that followed, I tried to rebuild my life. Everyone around me whispered and judged, reminding me of my mistakes. But in the quiet moments, I felt a sense of clarity. For the first time in years, I began to think about what I truly wanted. Not for Adil or Zayn, but for me. Looking back, I realized I couldn't undo the past, but I could learn from it. And maybe, just maybe, I could find a way forward. The weeks after Zayn left were the hardest of my life. The apartment felt eerily silent without him, and the weight of everything I had lost pressed down on me, unrelenting. Adil's absence, as expected, left a deep emptiness. Friends I thought I could rely on vanished, their judgment too heavy to hide behind polite words. But I couldn't afford to wallow. The first stage of rebuilding was painful, but necessary. I took a job at a nearby art supplies shop, where I spent my days surrounded by vibrant paints and empty canvases, both symbolizing potential but seldom used. Maya was the first to get in touch. She reached out one morning and proposed we meet for coffee. When she arrived, her tone was gentler than before, though her gaze remained cautious. "I'm not here to scold you," she said softly, "but I do want to know if you're okay." I hesitated, uncertain how to respond. "I'm not sure," I confessed, "but I'm trying." Maya nodded solemnly. "That's all you can do." Months later, just as the wounds were beginning to heal, a knock on my door disrupted the fragile calm I had achieved. I opened it and froze. Adil stood before me. He looked older than I remembered, his face weary, yet his presence still carried weight. The tension between us was thick as he stood there, scanning my face for any sign of change. "Can we talk?" Adil asked, his voice unexpectedly steady. I stepped aside to let him in. Still, the air was heavy with unspoken words. He didn't sit, instead standing by the window, gazing out at the street below. "I thought I'd hate you," he said quietly, "for what you did. And I ruined." I trailed off, sitting on the couch, my hands nervously twisting in my lap. "Let me finish," he said, turning to face me. "I thought I'd despise you, yet now all I feel is sorrow. For us, for what we might have been." His words hit harder than anything else could have. I hadn't meant to hurt him, but I did. "I didn't want to hurt you," I said, my voice quivering. "I know," he replied, his tone still full of anguish, "but that doesn't make it easier." We talked for hours, revisiting moments from our marriage that had seemed insignificant at the time, but now appeared significant. By the time he left, our anger had subsided, and we had reached an uneasy understanding. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something I could rely on. Zayn's departure left an emptiness I couldn't explain. Where had he gone? Did he regret it? Did he still think of me the way I thought of him? One evening, as I was leaving the art store, I found a note tucked behind my windshield wiper. My heart skipped when I saw the handwriting. "SAA," the letter began. "I thought leaving would make things easier, but it hasn't. I still think of you, of us. I wonder if you've moved on. I hope you have. Take care of yourself. Zayn." The letter wasn't signed, but it didn't need to be. I read it over and over, each word stirring a mixture of emotions: relief, sorrow, and a bit of selfish hope that I hadn't been forgotten. Inspired by the note, I began painting again. At first, it was just a way to fill the loneliness, a distraction from the noise in my mind. But as the canvases filled with color, I felt a part of me return, one I hadn't even realized was missing until then. One day, Maya stopped by and noticed the unexpected burst of creativity. She looked at the paintings on the walls and exclaimed, "These are amazing. You should show them." "I'm not sure," I hesitated. "Don't doubt yourself," Maya insisted. "You have something worth sharing." A year after Zane had left, fate brought him back into my life. I was at my own exhibition opening when I spotted him across the room. He looked older, but the pull was still there. "Sauna," he whispered as he approached. "Zay," I responded, my heart racing. We stood there for a while, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. "You did it," he said, nodding toward the paintings around us. "I had to," I replied, my voice steady. "For myself." He smiled, a grin tugging at the corners of his lips. "I'm proud of you." We talked for hours that night, catching up on everything and nothing. By the time the gallery emptied, the space between us was filled with silent understanding. Zane didn't stay in town, and his departure wasn't as painful as before. It felt like the end of a chapter, one that I would always cherish, despite the pain it caused. As I stood in my studio, surrounded by the hues and textures of my new life, I realized that while the past would always be a part of me, it wouldn't define me. For the first time in years, I felt at peace.